is just as bad or worse than the discrimination against black discrimination.
This professor's courageous stand against the hypocrisy of woke culture has left the academic world shaken, and his refusal to back down has made him a symbol of resistance for those who feel silenced by political correctness. So, what exactly did this professor say, and why is the woke crowd in such a frenzy? The professor's stand exposing woke double standards. Dr. Richard Hastings, a political science professor at a prestigious university, has always been a respected figure in academia. Known for his willingness to push boundaries and engage in difficult conversations, Hastings recently found himself at the center of a firestorm after a heated debate during a campus panel on free speech, identity politics, and social justice. In this panel, Hastings delivered a scathing critique of what he calls the hypocrisy of woke culture, particularly its selective application of free speech, academic freedom, and its treatment of different viewpoints. In front of a packed audience of students and faculty members, Hastings didn't mince words. "We claim to value diversity of thought and free expression on this campus, but the reality is, we only tolerate opinions that fit a narrow woke agenda. If you don't subscribe to that ideology, you're ostracized, silenced, or worse, labeled as a bigot. That's not academic freedom, that's tyranny." Hastings then went on to describe the contradictions in how woke ideology applies its principles. He argued that, while the woke movement claims to fight for inclusion, it often excludes or silences voices that challenge its own narrative. If a conservative student expresses their views on traditional values or free markets, they're immediately shouted down or threatened with disciplinary action, Hastings explained. But if a progressive student advocates for policies that vilify an entire group of people based on their race or political affiliation, it's framed as brave and necessary. That's the double standard I'm talking about. These remarks didn't just stir the room, they struck a deep nerve across the entire campus. Students and faculty who align with the woke movement were quick to accuse Hastings of being insensitive and out of touch. But Hastings wasn't fazed. For him, the only way to have an honest and open dialogue is to call out the inconsistencies and double standards of woke culture head on. The double standards in academia. What Hastings highlighted. Hastings' critique didn't just focus on free speech, it went much deeper, targeting the very fabric of woke culture's influence on academia. Hastings highlighted several key examples of how woke activists selectively apply their principles, often in ways that directly contradict their own stated values. These double standards, he argued, have not only stifled intellectual freedom, but have also damaged the integrity of higher education. One of the most glaring examples Hastings pointed out was the unequal treatment of different student groups on campus. We've seen student groups shut down events featuring conservative speakers because their views were considered hateful, he said. Yet those same students have no problem inviting speakers who openly call for the dismantling of entire social structures or advocate for violence against certain political groups. How can we claim to support free speech when only one side is allowed to speak? Hastings didn't stop there. He criticized how academic standards have been bent to accommodate woke narratives, often at the expense of intellectual rigor. Certain courses and fields of study, he explained, have been overtaken by woke ideology, leaving little room for dissenting perspectives. If you challenge the dominant narrative in many of these classes, you're labeled as someone who doesn't care about social justice or equality, Hastings said. But real progress only happens when we allow all ideas to be examined critically. Perhaps the most powerful part of Hastings's critique was his focus on the treatment of students themselves. He revealed that many conservative and moderate students feel marginalized and silenced in an environment that supposedly celebrates diversity and inclusion. I've had students come to me, afraid to speak up in class because they know their views will be dismissed or ridiculed, Hastings said. We've created an environment where students are learning to self-censor, and that's the opposite of what a university should be. The backlash. Woke activists and faculty respond predictably. Dr. Hastings' comments were met with fierce backlash from woke activists on campus. Several student groups issued statements condemning his remarks, accusing him of being insensitive to marginalized communities, and claiming that his critique of woke culture was dangerous to the safety of students. One particularly vocal group even called for an investigation into whether Hastings' comments violated the university's policies on hate speech and inclusivity. Faculty members aligned with the woke ideology were just as quick to criticize Hastings. Some called his remarks irresponsible and divisive. A professor from the Gender Studies department tweeted, "Dr. Hastings is perpetuating harmful ideas that threaten the progress we've made toward a more inclusive campus. His comments about free speech are a thinly veiled defense of outdated and oppressive views." Despite the backlash, Hastings remained steadfast. In a follow-up interview, he doubled down on his critique, stating that the very reaction to his comments proved his point. Instead of engaging in a thoughtful discussion about these issues, the response has been to label me as dangerous or hateful, he said. That's exactly the kind of suppression of ideas I was talking about. Hastings also pointed out the irony in the woke activists' response. They claim to support inclusivity and diversity, but they're unwilling to include diverse viewpoints that don't align with their own, he said. It's ironic. They talk about creating safe spaces, but those spaces are only safe for people who already agree with them. That's not inclusivity. It's exclusion. Hastings' defense of free speech. Why it matters. One of the central themes of Dr. Hastings' critique was his unwavering defense of free speech and the importance of open dialogue, especially in academic settings. For Hastings, the growing intolerance for differing opinions poses a direct threat to intellectual freedom and undermines the very purpose of higher education. Universities are supposed to be places where ideas are debated, where students are exposed to a wide range of perspectives, Hastings explained. But when we create environments where only one viewpoint is allowed, we're not educating, we're indoctrinating. And that's dangerous, not just for the students, but for society as a whole. Hastings emphasized that free speech isn't about protecting offensive or harmful ideas. It's about ensuring that all ideas, even those we disagree with, can be debated openly. The solution to bad ideas is more speech, not less, he said. If we want to combat harmful ideologies, we need to be able to discuss them openly, challenge them, and expose their flaws. Silencing dissent doesn't solve anything, it just drives it underground. This defense of free speech resonated with many students and faculty who have grown increasingly concerned about the erosion of academic freedom on campuses across the country. For them, Hastings' willingness to speak out was a refreshing reminder that not everyone in academia has succumbed to the pressure of woke culture. Woke culture's hypocrisy. Hastings calls it out. Another key aspect of Dr. Hastings' critique was his focus on the hypocrisy inherent in woke culture. He pointed out that many of the individuals who advocate for social justice and equality often engage in behavior that directly contradicts those values. Woke culture claims to be about inclusivity, but it's actually one of the most exclusive movements I've ever seen, Hastings remarked. If you don't agree with their exact ideology, you're labeled as the enemy and shut out of the conversation. Hastings also addressed how woke activists weaponize language to control the narrative. They've created a whole new vocabulary to label anyone who disagrees with them as a bad person, he said. Words like racist, sexist, homophobe. These labels are thrown around so casually that they've lost their meaning, and that's dangerous because it shuts down conversation. If you agree with Dr. Hastings' message, hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What do you think about his takedown of woke culture's double standards? Let's keep the conversation going.